Weimar Germany was a state of Germany between 1919 and 1933, from the end of World War I to Hitler's takeover of power. So as you can see here, before World War I started, we have Imperial Germany, which then became Weimar Germany. And then, of course, when Hitler took power in January 1933, we have Nazi Germany. But for now, we're going to be looking at Weimar Germany, also known as the Weimar Republic. So before we do that, it's important to look at some of the key events that happened at the end of World War I. So at the end of World War I, we have the 29th of September 1918. This is when, the war didn't look too good for Germany. We have the army generals recommending an armistice and the formation of a new government. And on the 3rd of October 1918, we actually had that new government formed. And it's the start of the German Revolution. People are going hungry. People are getting angry. We have the start the German Revolution. On the 31st of October 1918, with the Kiel Mutiny. This is basically sailors refusing to set foot to sail. It's a rebellion against the army's orders. So with the Kiel Mutiny. And we have Bavaria. Bavaria is a state in Germany. The capital of Bavaria is Munich. We have Bavaria being declared a socialist republic. On the 9th of November 1918, with Germany actually declared a republic, and Friedrich Ebert is new president. Of course, Friedrich Ebert, he's an important figure. He is the first president of the Weimar Republic. On the 10th of November 1918, with the Kaiser fled to the Netherlands, and there is an agreement which allows the army to retain its existing status in the new Weimar Republic. And with the formation of the Free Corps, who are basically just ex-right-wing soldiers. On the 11th of November 1918, with the armistice signed and the end of World War I, of course. 11th November 1918, important date in history. The 28th of June 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, we had the Treaty of Versailles signed. And on August 1919, we had the new constitution complete and the Weimar Republic is officially established. And this is also the end of the German Revolution. So there's two important terms you'll come across fairly often in this topic. And that is these two terms here. We have November criminals, and these are basically just politicians who agreed to the armistice, the 11th of November 1918 armistice, the end of World War I. So these are just politicians who agreed to that. And we also have the stab in the back, which is the theory that the army didn't really lose, and that it was only let down by the weak politicians who signed the armistice. So the next thing you need to understand is the political spectrum. On the left here, in red, we have the left who promote change, and on the right we have the nationalists who prefer to retain traditional values. Now if we go far left, we have communism, and this is a dictatorship. And if we go far right, we also have Nazism or fascism, and this is also a dictatorship or an autocracy. Now communists, they generally have principles of everybody being equal, which is egalitarianism, and the government owns everything in a classless, stateless society. And on the right we have, on the far right, the Nazis and fascists generally have ideas of the wealthy class staying at the helm of power. Now most parties in today's society will be towards the center, and there'll be a democracy in where you can elect your own leaders. The people can elect their own leaders. But in communism and fascism and Nazism, you cannot elect your own leaders. You're running under a dictatorship. Now, the Weimar Republic actually faced threats from many different groups. Obviously, after the Treaty of Versailles was signed, there was a lot of bitterness in Germany, especially from the nationalists. But we have threats from the left, or the communists, and from the right, the nationalists, and I'll list some of them here. So on the left, we have the Spartacus Revolt. Which I'll go into more detail in, but that was on January 1919. We also have a revolt in the Ruhr region. That was in 1920. In 1919, we also have a revolt in Bavaria. And we can't forget about the Russian Revolution, which was in October 2017, which was in October 1917. So the Russian Revolution, also known as the Bolshevik Revolution. So that was in October 1917. And on the right, we have the Cat Putsch, which was in 1920. So we have the Cat Putsch. We also have the Munich Putsch, Hitler's Munich or Beer Hall Putsch. So that was in 1923. So the Munich Putsch. Munich Putsch, 1923. So let's go into more detail into the Spartacus Revolt. So the Spartacus Revolt, that was the first communist revolt in January 1919. And Spartacus were just Germans who held communist beliefs. They were similar to the Bolsheviks in Russia. But the Spartacus Revolt was led by a guy called Karl Liebknecht. And he argued against the new democratic Germany, and he wanted Germany to be led by Soviets. So he set up Soviets in many towns, and Friedrich Ebert, the Weimar president, made an agreement with the Free Corps to put down the Spartacus rebellion. So there was a street fight between the Spartacists and the Free Corps. So the Free Corps were obviously the ex-nationalist soldiers. Ex-nationalist soldiers. So there was a battle. There was a battle between the Spartacists and the Free Corps. So I should put versus Spartacists. So this was held in Berlin. So the Spartacus Revolt was in Berlin. And the Free Corps ended up crushing the Spartacists. And there were a high number of casualties. And Liebknecht and Luxemburg, so Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, the two leaders, I should also put Rosa Luxemburg, they were actually murdered by the Free Corps. So it was a failed rebellion. I'll talk about the 1919 revolution in Bavaria. So in Bavaria, there was another communist revolution in 1919. And Bavaria was actually a socialist republic, we've seen that. And it was led by Kurt Eisner. So Bavaria was led by Kurt Eisner. I should do that in white. Kurt Eisner. And he was Ebert's ally. And Eisner was murdered by political opponents. He was actually murdered. So he was murdered by political opponents. So the communists actually took over Bavaria. They actually ended up succeeding in taking over all of Bavaria. So I'll write that down, took over all of Bavaria. So then we have Ebert, Friedrich Ebert. Obviously he's a president of the Weimar Republic. He sent the Free Corps to crush the revolt, and that resulted in over 600 communists being killed. 600 communists were killed. And I'll talk about the Ruhr. There was tension in the Ruhr in 1920. So in the Ruhr, 1920, there was more communist agitation, and there was another battle with the communists against the Free Corps, and there were 2,000 casualties. So another battle. There was increasing tension, and there was eventually another battle between the communists and the Free Corps with 2,000 casualties. So, clearly Ebert's been using the Free Corps again to put down these revolts, and so Ebert's ruthless measures created bitterness between the communists and his Socialist Party. So the thing is, many Germans didn't like these communists anyways because they didn't want to go the same way as Russia, but communism still remained a powerful anti-government force through the 1920s. So let's take a look at some of the threats from the right, in particular the Kapp Putsch, which was in 1920. So Friedrich Ebert's government faced violent opposition from the right. Far-right people resented the Treaty of Versailles. They liked the Kaiser's rule, and they wanted an empire with a powerful Germany. They despised the army restrictions, the military restrictions, 100,000 men, and the losses of territory and industry. So in March 1920, Dr. Wolfgang Kapp led 5,000 Free Corps into Berlin into a rebellion. So in March 1920, Dr. Wolfgang Kapp, so he led 5,000 Free Corps into Berlin. And this was known as a Kapp Putsch. So I should write here, Kapp Putsch. Kapp Putsch. So the army in Berlin actually refused to fire on the Free Corps. So it looked as if Ebert's government was doomed. However, it was actually saved by the German people. The industrialist workers of Berlin actually declared a general strike, which brought capital to a halt, which meant there was no transport, power, or water. So there was a general strike. So it was ended by a general strike of workers in Berlin. So, Mr. Kapp here, he realized he couldn't succeed and he left the country. He was actually caught and died while awaiting trial. So it seemed as though Weimar did indeed have support and power of the people. So Ebert's government struggled to deal with political violence in Germany. Assassinations were frequent. In 1922, we have Walter Ruthenau, the foreign minister, who was murdered by extremists. Hitler led an attempted rebellion in Munich in 1923, his famous beer hall putsch. Hitler and the people who murdered Ruthenau, the foreign minister, actually received very short prison sentences. So short prison sentences. And they got off very lightly, and it's probably due to the fact that the right-wing people had judges who were friends. And they sympathized with Hitler because they didn't like the Treaty of Versailles either. All of the right-wing judges despised the Treaty of Versailles, so they saw where Hitler was coming from. They sympathized with him, and that's why he got a short prison sentence. So I want to quickly go over the hyperinflation crisis, which was quite significant. So the hyperinflation crisis of 1923. And so we know, to start us off, Germany's major economic resources were removed by the Treaty of Versailles. So Germany's economic resources were actually removed by Versailles. So with the Saarland, that was a major coal producer that was actually given to the League of Nations for 15 years before a plebiscite was held. All the colonies, all of that, it made Germany's ability to repay reparations much more difficult. Secondly, the second event that happened was the $6.6 billion reparations bill was settled. So the $6.6 billion reparations bill. And this was one of the terms of Versailles. The next event, Germany failed to pay its reparations in 1923. In 1922. In 1922, Germany actually skipped a reparations bill. Germany skipped a reparations bill. It's understandable, but they probably were having a difficult time paying the reparations and keeping the people in check. I mean, there were many homeless people. We'll go into that later. But in 1922, they actually skipped a reparations bill. So the French weren't happy about this. They said, "Where's our money?" So the French and Belgian troops actually marched into the Ruhr region and began to seize raw materials for themselves. So not only the French, but also the Belgian troops invaded the Ruhr. And they invaded the Ruhr in Germany to seize raw materials. I should write that, to seize materials. So next, we have Germany, who responds with a policy of passive resistance. So Germany responds, they counter this with passive resistance. So this basically means the people in the Ruhr region aren't gonna work. They're basically gonna cut off they're gonna stop producing materials so that the French and Belgian troops don't have anything to gain. So Germany responds with passive resistance. So no materials are going to be produced in the Ruhr region. So the French weren't happy about this. They reacted harshly, killing over 100 German workers. So the French killed over 100 German workers. Next, the halt in German industrial production, clearly with passive resistance, nothing's being produced. This halt in industrial production actually led to the collapse of the German economy. So we have halt in industrial production. Leads to the collapse of the German economy. So after that, to pay for the policy of passive resistance, the German government actually begins to print more money. These workers aren't just going to stop producing materials for free. They need to be paid somehow. They still need food to eat. So in order to fund these guys, in order to fund passive resistance, the government just says, okay, we're finding it difficult. We have to pay reparations. Let's just print more money. So to fund passive resistance, to pay for policy of passive resistance, the German government begins to print more money. So German government prints more money. This is known as inflation, obviously. So ninth, the effect was that the value of money goes down and prices go up. So inflation occurred. Hyperinflation actually occurred because it got really bad. But anyway, inflation, the value of money goes down, prices go up. So value of money goes down, but prices go up. So the Weimar government was actually blamed for the hyperinflation crisis. The people said, hey, to pay for the policy of passive resistance, you're the people who printed more money, so you're to blame for the hyperinflation crisis. So the Weimar government was blamed for the crisis. Weimar government was blamed for this crisis. So we have a clever guy called Gustav Stresemann, who was the next chancellor. I believe he was chancellor in 1923. He was appointed, and he actually ended the hyperinflation crisis. So Gustav Stresemann, he formed the new government, and he ended the hyperinflation crisis. The first thing he did was he called off passive resistance. So passive resistance called off. So the workers in the Ruhr actually began to produce materials again. Passive resistance called off. And the old German currency was replaced by a new one, the Rentenmark. So new currency. He introduced the Rentenmark. And Stresemann renegotiated the reparations payments and received US loans via the Dawes Plan. So renegotiated reparations and received loans via the 1924 Dawes Plan. So let's take a look at the impact of World War I on Germany by 1918. So impact of World War I on Germany. So this is pretty important to learn the impacts which World War I had and the implications that it also had for Germany. So let's go into different branches here. We have the social impact. On the right here, we can go off into the political impact. If we go upwards here, we can have a look at the economic impact World War I had on Germany. So the economic, I did not spell that correctly. Economic impact. And so let's explore each one. So the economic impact. We know that after World War I, Germany was virtually bankrupt. So Germany was virtually bankrupt. If we go off here, we have the war left 600,000 widows and 2 million children without fathers. By 1925, the state was spending about 1/3 of its budget in war pensions. So that's pretty significant. So we have 600,000 widows. So these are women who have lost their husbands. 2 million children without fathers. So 2 million fatherless children. And by 1925, the state was spending about 1/3 of its budget in war pensions. state spending 1/3, that's a lot, of its budget on war pensions. On war pensions. Okay, so if we look over here, we also have industrial production. It was about 2/3 of what it had been in 1913. So there was a massive halt in industrial production. So industrial production only 2/3 of what it had been in 1913. We also have national income. National income was about 1/3 of what it had been in 1913, so national income had plummeted. National income 1/3 of what it had been in 1913. And we also have acute shortages of food. So by 1918, Germany was only producing 50% of the milk, 60% of the butter and meat it had produced before the war. Fuel was short and people were cold. Nearly 300,000 people died from starvation and hypothermia in 1918 alone. So 300,000 dead from starvation or hypothermia, and that was in 1918 alone. Okay, so that's some of the economic impacts of the war on Germany. Let's take a look at some of the social impacts. So the war really deepened divisions in German society. So deepened divisions in German society. So there were huge gaps. There were huge gaps between the living standards of the rich and the poor. So I'll just write living standard gaps between rich and poor. With 1.5 million demobilized soldiers returned to society, many were disillusioned. So the new society was meant to be great, but it didn't really help anyone. It didn't really solve much. So 1.5 million demobilized soldiers returned to society. Many disillusioned. We also have many German workers who were bitter at the restrictions placed on their earnings during the war, while the factory owners made vast fortunes from the war. So we could just say German workers bitter. So these workers were bitter because there were restrictions placed on their earnings. But factory owners actually made vast fortunes from the war. So because they had restrictions, but factory owners, they profited from the war. Factory owners made vast fortunes. And now let's take a look at the political impact of World War I on Germany. So Germany had a revolution, we'd seen that earlier, and became an unstable democratic republic. Groups with extremist political views tried to gain power. So unstable democratic republic, that's something noteworthy. Unstable democratic republic. Groups with extremist political views. So extreme groups
tried to gain power. We've seen this via the Spartacus revolt, the Cat Putsch, etc. The Bavaria, the Raw. Extreme groups tried to gain political power. So the stresses of war led to a revolution in October to November 1918. There was fighting between right-wing and left-wing groups, so revolution. So basically the war led to the German Revolution, which was basically just fighting between right-wing groups and left-wing groups, so left versus right. We also have many ex-soldiers and civilians who despise the new democratic leaders. So ex-soldiers and civilians they despised the new democratic leaders and came to believe that the heroic leader field Marshal Hindenburg had been betrayed by weak politicians. So anyway, these civilians despised new leaders, the new democratic leaders. They believed Hindenburg had actually been betrayed by weak politicians. So those are all of the impacts of World War I on Germany. Of course, the hyperinflation crisis was caused by the funding of passive resistance in the rural region and the printing of money. But Germany was already poor by the end of World War I. And the reason it was poor is because the German government relied mainly on borrowing money and printing money. It did not worry about getting into debt, as it assumed it could repay debts with the money and resources it would receive from defeated enemies after the war. So when Germany itself was defeated, this whole plan collapsed. Germany had a large debt worsened by having to pay reparations rather than receiving them. The government also faced a large post-war pensions bill. Faced with these problems, a new democratic regime, the Weimar Republic, followed its predecessor, the Imperial German government, by printing more money rather than greatly increasing taxes, and this is what also led to the hyperinflation crisis. So if we draw a quick diagram here with the US, who's actually giving loans. The US is giving loans to Germany. The US is giving loans to Germany. Germany's paying reparations. Germany's paying reparations to the UK and France. And the UK and France are paying war debts to the US. So if any of these one things in the triangle collapses, the whole plan collapses. So if the US stops giving loans to Germany, Germany can't pay reparations. It means the UK and France can't pay war debts to the US. Yeah, this is the basic triangle of how reparations, war debts, and loans worked at the time. So let's take a look at the winners and losers of the hyperinflation crisis. So let me do in yellow the winners of the hyperinflation crisis, and in red the losers of this crisis. So the winners were people who had to owe money, the people who were in debt. People who were in debt. Because the people in debt could just pay off their debts now. I mean, their debts were basically nothing. If you owed $20,000, that's basically nothing now. It's worth nothing because the value of money has gone down so significantly. So if you're in debt, you're a winner. People with foreign currency were also winners. People with foreign currency. Obviously, if you had foreign currency, it didn't really affect the hyperinflation crisis. Didn't really affect you because it only applied to the German currency. People with physical goods and tangible assets. So people with tangible assets. So obviously the value of money went down, but the value of houses didn't actually go down. So if you had tangible assets, you were also a winner. Now losers, conversely, losers were people with money in the bank. So people who had, so people with money in the bank. If you had $1 million in the bank, well, if you had $100,000 in the bank, that's basically worth nothing now. So all that money you've saved up is worth virtually nothing because the value of the dollar's gone down. So if you had money in the bank, saved it up, you're a loser. So all the middle class, the white collar, I think the middle class should really be blue collar. I guess it doesn't really matter. But all the people who are saving money, they're losers. If you're owed money, people who are owed money, they're also losers. If you're owed $100,000, that $100,000 that you're owed is basically worth nothing now, so you're a loser. People on a fixed income. People on fixed income are also losers to the hyperinflation crisis. If you're on $20,000 a year, that $20,000 is basically worth nothing. So you have winners and losers in the hyperinflation crisis. Let's take a quick look at Hitler's 25-point program. Hitler's 25 points, which were the 25 points of the Nazi Party. So it does come up. It's not the most important thing, but we'll skim over it. This is just a simplified version. So firstly, the unity of all German-speaking peoples. It's fairly obvious. 2, the abolition of the Treaty of Versailles. So get rid of that. That was of course one of the most major Nazi policies. Land and colonies to feed Germany's population. That was Lebensraum, expanding the living space. Only Germans can be citizens. No Jew can be a German citizen, so that's anti-Semitism right there. People in Germany who are not citizens must obey special laws for foreigners. So again, anti-Semitism right there. Must obey special laws for foreigners. Only German citizens can vote, be employed, or hold public office. Only German citizens. So we're kind of putting an emphasis on the German people. Everyone else are basically inferior. Citizens are entitled to a job and a decent standard of living. So a job, decent standard of living. This cannot be achieved. Foreigners with no rights as citizens should be expelled. So again, we're looking at German superiority and foreigner inferiority. No further immigration of non-German must be allowed. All foreigners who have come to Germany since 1914 must be expelled, so all foreigners must go. No further immigration. All citizens have equal rights and duties. The first duty of a citizen is to work. So we're getting into ideas of conscription here. You must work. All payments to unemployed people should end. All payments to unemployed people should end, so no pensions or doles or benefits. All profits made by profiteers during the war must be shared. All profits made by profiteers must be shared. Nationalization of public industries, so they have to be owned by the government, no private public industries. Large companies must share their profits. So we've got kind of socialism ideologies here. Even though Nazism was on the far right, it was also anti-capitalist. Pensions must be improved. Help for small shops and businesses. Large department stores must be closed down. So he's wanting to improve small shops and businesses. Property reform to give small farmers their land, so he wants the support of small farmers. An all-out battle against criminals, profiteers who must be punished by death, so the death penalty. Reform of the law to make it more German, so more German law, German superiority. Improve education so that all Germans can get a job, so improvement in education, that's an attractive feature. He also wanted to improve people's health by making it a law for people to do sport, so forcing people to do PE and get healthier. He wanted an abolition of the army and a new people's army in its place, so abolition of the army and a new people's army. Germans' newspapers must be free of foreign influence, so no foreigners. Freedom of religion. and a strong central government with unrestricted authority. So a strong central government. This is kind of totalitarian right there. So those are Hitler's 25 points simplified, very simplified, but it's good to go over them briefly. So let's take a look at Hitler's general background, the important parts of Hitler's background. Most obviously, Hitler hated Jews. He was full of anti-Semitism. There was actually suspicions that he was one quarter Jewish, so he had to suppress those suspicions. Some people say he was shy, awkward, and moody, unable to form loving ties due to his repressive father and pampered by his mother. He was lonely and isolated. He sequestered himself, contemptuous of mankind, suspicious. He admired strength and success, and he absorbed in fantasies. He actually became convinced he was destined to play a great role in Germany. Um, let's have a look at his general skills and abilities. So, general skills. And then let's look at his propaganda skills. Those are significant. Propaganda skills. And then we have his basic ideas. So Hitler's basic ideas. And I also want to mark some key dates in here quickly. Well, I'll put in a key date that I think is particularly significant. In July 1921, he actually becomes the leader of the German Workers' Party, the DAP, and he changed the name. Well, the name was actually changed to NSDAP in February 1920, but he becomes chairman. He becomes chairman of the NSDAP in July 1921. So some of his general skills and abilities were commitment. He had tremendous energy. And remarkable willpower. You can see this by watching some of his speeches. And he was also a single-minded fanatic. Okay, some of his propaganda skills was that he was a great orator. He was able to convince the German people that he would solve Germany's problems. He had a sort of hypnotic effect on his audience. Had a hypnotic effect on his audience. He was a supreme master of psychology, of mass politics. He had a gift for exploiting anxiety and discontent. So he managed to exploit the anxiety and discontent of the people. And he put all of the people's discontent into words that the crowd was longing to hear. Anyway, he was able to exploit the people's anxiety and discontent and put it into words that the crowd was longing to hear. So, put it into words that the crowd could relate to, into words crowd could relate to, and was longing to hear. Was longing to hear. So he promised to revoke the Treaty of Versailles to make Germany great, to build a great army, and to get revenge on those countries that did them wrong. Hitler's basic ideas, the first of which is obviously anti-Semitism. We'll go into further detail on why Hitler hated minorities later, but anti-Semitism, the purity of German blood, was being defiled by Jews, and that they should be excluded from Germany. Social Darwinism was basically the survival of the fittest. Germans should form a master race to dominate others. Germans, so it's basically Germans should form a master race to dominate others, other races. You can see Nazism is filled with racism and all that sort of stuff to dominate others. So social Darwinism is the idea Germans should form a master race. Pan-Germanism. This is pretty simple. It's just the belief that all Germans should join together. So Germans should join together. Lebensraum. This will come up later as one of Hitler's foreign policy aims, but Lebensraum was basically Germany must expand to take over more territory and living space to feed her population. Germany must expand to feed her population. We also have anti-Marxism. So Hitler was hostile to the ideas of Karl Marx, the communist, the German philosopher, economist, and revolutionary. Marx was a non-religious Jew. Maybe that's one of the reasons he hated him. So, anti-Marxism. Anti-democracy. Hitler was indeed anti-democracy. So, if he was in the center, he would have been for democracy, but he's actually far right. Nazism is far right, so it is anti-democracy. He believed democracy provided a weak government and it should be replaced by a one-party state based on the principle of an all-powerful leader. Clearly, that would have been him. Other ideas he frequently expressed was anti-capitalism. So although he was far right, he was actually anti-capitalist. He disliked what he called finance capitalism, the power that came from being very rich. This again was associated with Jews, because Jews were very rich. So he disliked them. They were very rich and successful generally. He criticized big business, large firms which often harmed small producers. So criticized big business. Criticized big business. But he did believe that the wealthy should generally be at the helm of power. So it is somewhat difficult to try and get an idea. But he was anti-capitalist basically because of the Jews, and he criticized big business. He tried to help smaller businesses. But although he hated Marxism, he was in favor of socialism. This doesn't mean he's on the left, however, so it is somewhat confusing. But he spoke in favor of socialism and stressing the needs of the national community. So needs of national community. He stressed the needs of the national community. So he wanted to help small businesses. We could see that from his 25-point program. Some other important things about Hitler. He was actually born in Bronam in Austria. He was actually a general in the army. In 1889 he was born. And in 1919 he was employed as a spy by Bavarian's army to spy on the DAP. And he went to a DAP meeting and actually joined and became a committee member. And as I said, in 1921, he actually became the chairman, and he changed the DAP name to Nationalist Socialist DAP, NSDAP, which is where Nazi comes from, Nationalist Socialist Nazi. That's where that comes from. So let's go into some more detail regarding the Munich Putsch, or also known as Hitler's Beer Hall Putsch, which was carried out in 1923. So Hitler believed he actually had the support of the German army via Ludendorff, because Ludendorff
and Hindenburg were two leaders of the German army in World War I. So Hitler, he actually believed he had the support of army via Ludendorff. As I said, Ludendorff was one of the leaders of the German army, along with Hindenburg. The Bavarian government was right-wing, and Hitler believed it would support a Nazi putsch. So Bavarian government was right-wing. So Hitler believed it would support a Nazi putsch. There were also weaknesses of the Weimar Republic. So weaknesses, I'll just write it down, weaknesses of Weimar Republic. So the unpopularity of the way hyperinflation crisis came to an end, and the unpopularity of Versailles. So the military restrictions, reparations, the lost colonies, the war guilt, the territorial changes. So we have the unpopularity of hyperinflation crisis, and Versailles. So because of the unpopularity of these things, and this demonstrated the weakness of the Weimar Republic, which is one of the reasons why Hitler believed his Munich putsch would have the support of the people and the army. He thought it would be successful. Another reason Hitler carried out the Munich putsch is because Mussolini actually came to power in Italy in 1922. So Mussolini, the Italian dictator, came to power. He actually came to power via the March on Rome in 1923. March on Rome in 1923. Sorry, in 1922, and this was by force. So this actually inspired Hitler. He thought he could do the same. This actually inspired Hitler. So let's go into the details of the Munich putsch. We might as well. So I'll write this down. So on the 8th of November, 1923, Otto von Losser and Gustav von Kahr were addressing a meeting of 2,000 right-wing supporters in a Munich beer hall. And on this day, so this is when the Munich putsch was, the 8th of November 1923, Hitler and his stormtroopers, the SA, burst into the meeting. They declared a national revolution. Gun in the hand, Hitler forces Kahr and Losser, the leaders of Bavaria, into a side room. The two men are forced to state their support for the March on Berlin to impose a new government with General Ludendorff as the new commander-in-chief. Meanwhile, thousands of stormtroopers seize other members of Bavarian government. They terrorize their opponents. So SA actually terrorizes opponents. But they fail to gain control of the army barracks. So after Losser and von Kahr promised loyalty to the putsch, they pledge allegiance to the NSDAP. Ludendorff actually allows them to leave the beer hall. And on the 9th of November, the next day, on the 9th of November, in Berlin, President Friedrich Ebert declares a national state of emergency because of the treason in Munich. General Secht orders Losser to crush the revolt. So Losser and Kahr now issue a proclamation denouncing the putsch, and Ludendorff persuades Hitler not to give up and to march into Munich to seize power as a first step to marching on Berlin. Ludendorff is actually convinced that the soldiers will support their former commander and certainly will not fire on him. So at noon, 2,000 armed Nazis, gaining some public support, march to a military base in Munich. They're met by armed police and Bavarian soldiers. A shot is fired, probably by a Nazi, and the police return fire. So there is some fire between the police and the 2,000 armed Nazis. 14 Nazis are killed, including the person next to Hitler. 14 Nazis killed, including the person next to Hitler. So imagine if Hitler was a person killed. That would have rewrote history. Most Nazis fall to the ground and take cover. Hitler dislocates his shoulder in its fall, then flees. Ludendorff continues to march up to the police, and Ludendorff is arrested, and the putsch fails. So on the 11th of November, Hitler is arrested. So on the 11th of November, Hitler is actually arrested, and Sekt bans the Nazis. So Hitler arrested, and Sekt. This is the same day as the armistice. This is actually the same day as the armistice in 1918, so 5 years earlier was the armistice. But anyway, Hitler's arrested, and Sekt bans the Nazi Party. Bans the Nazi Party for their putsch. Now, in February 1924, Hitler, Ludendorff, and other leaders are tried for treason, which carries a death penalty. Hitler turns the trial into an opportunity to attack the Weimar regime and expound his views. So Hitler turns trial into a way to gain publicity. And attack Weimar regime and denounce it, expound his views, attack Weimar regime. Hitler actually achieves national fame. He achieves national fame as a result of this. As a result of this trial, he achieves national fame. And the trial just before the elections helps the Nazi vote. The February 1924 trial actually helps the Nazi vote. The Nazis become the third largest group in Bavaria. The judges are sympathetic. Ludendorff is acquitted. Hitler is sentenced to the minimum possible sentence of 5 years in prison, but he only actually ends up staying for 9 months. He's sentenced for 5 years, but only stays for 9 months. The judges accepted Ludendorff's explanation that he had only been present by accident, an excuse he had also previously used in 1920 over his involvement in the Kapp putsch. So most people are sympathetic to Hitler and Ludendorff, hence the soft punishments. They understood why Hitler tried to do the Munich putsch, because of the failure of the Weimar regime, the bitterness toward Versailles. Everyone felt that. So there was some leniency towards Hitler. Hitler was kept in good conditions in Landsberg prison. While there, he dictates Mein Kampf, and the Nazis nearly disintegrate without their leader. On 24th of December 1924, Hitler is released after 9 months. So on December 1924, Hitler is actually released from jail after 9 months. So he didn't stay in there for long at all. Now I want to look at some of the Weimar Germany election results from 1919 to 1933. So election results. And we're going to focus on the NSDAP, and because they're the really most important ones. A lot of the other ones don't really matter. We can really look, well, actually, let's look at the KPD, the German Communist Party, the SPD, the Social Democratic Party. They were also left, but not quite as left as the KPD. So maybe I should put them in a slightly less red color. SPD right here. That's not a real good color. Maybe this color right there, SPD. They were red, but not as red as the KPD. And we also have the NSDAP, of course, which was far right. we can look at the percentages respectively. We can have a look at January 1919. We can look at June 1920. These are all the different elections. I believe there was an election held every I can't remember the exact date. But in May 1924 there was another election. December 1924, so not long after. May 1928. September 1930. July 1932. November 1932. And finally we have March 1933. Alright, so let's look at the KPD's results. So in January 1919, the KPD, we don't have a result for them, but in June 1920, we have 2% result for the KPD. May 1924, 13%. December 1924, 9%. May 1928, 11%. 13%. 15%, 17%, and 12%. So as you can see, as we get up to 1932, after the Great Depression, which was in 1929, you can see a general rise in support for the KPD. Now the SPD, which was generally quite a popular party, starts with 38%. It's very popular. I want to get that same color. Let me get that color picking tool right there. I've got that color. We start with 38%, 22%, 21%, 26%, 30%, 25%, 22%, 20%, and 18%. So after the Great Depression, we have a general decline in support for this more conventional party. The NSDAP has some interesting results. We don't have results for these 2 years. We have 7% here, 3%, 3%, relatively low. This is during the Stresemann era, so the golden age, so there's no need to vote for extreme political parties. 18%, 38%, 33%, and 34%. So you can see a general rise in popularity after the Great Depression, which is when people were getting desperate, so they started to vote for extreme parties. Hyperinflation was getting bad. In these few years, they wanted to achieve power by force, but then they began to realize that after the Munich Putsch, they should actually try to achieve power through actual legal means. They should try and do it legally. So consequences of the Munich Putsch. We rewrite that. Consequences of the 1923 Munich Putsch. There were a few consequences of this putsch. Hitler used his trial to gain national publicity. So he used it to attack the Weimar regime and expound his views and put forward Nazi policies. So Hitler actually used his trial to gain national publicity. In 1923, the NSDAP was little known outside Bavaria, with only 3,000 members. That was before the Munich Putsch in 1923. So there were only 3,000 members. It was little known. That's why the votes were relatively low. And who's this leader who took power in July 1921? Some obscure Austrian corporal. Who cares about him? But after the Munich Putsch, this is what allows Hitler to gain national publicity. As a result of the Munich Putsch, this is what allowed the Nazis to really expound their ideas and disperse them to the people. Yeah, he used it to disseminate Nazi ideas. He received 5 years imprisonment, but only served 9 months. So only served 9 months. I think we've covered that already. Only served 9 months. He wrote Mein Kampf in jail. That's his famous book, which sold thousands and thousands of copies. he wrote Mein Kampf, it really made clear some of his ideas and was created to try and get people to understand where the Nazi Party was coming from, some Nazi ideas, further disseminate these ideas. The NSDAP was temporarily banned. The NSDAP temporarily banned by Sect. Temporarily banned. And the NSDAP changed its policy to gaining power peacefully via elections. So, changed policy to gaining power peacefully via elections. I want to talk about the Stresemann era, also known as the Golden Age. Stresemann era, which was from 1923 to 1929. It's also known as the Golden Age. And Stresemann was obviously the Chancellor of Germany, and he ended up becoming Foreign Minister, organizing the Dawes Plan and all that sort of stuff. And he ended a lot of Germany's problems. So he was able to bring peace and stability to Germany. And the Germans had overcome most of their problems during the Golden Age. So let's have a look at some of the positives and negatives of some different aspects. So if we look at some of the positives for foreign policy, we have Germany actually joins the League of Nations in 1926. So Germany joins the League of Nations. Germany joins the League of Nations, so it has a voice now in some international affairs. Joins the League of Nations, which we'll go further into detail in 1926. Germany signs the Treaty of Locarno, so it doesn't want to adjust its western borders. Doesn't make any mention of its eastern borders, however, but this is signed in 1925, so it's happy with its western borders. It won't try and alter them in any way. Some negatives of foreign policy, however, is Stresemann, the Chancellor, was actually attacked by nationalists for joining the League of Nations. Some people didn't believe that joining the League was a good idea. So, let me do that in white. Stresemann attacked by nationalists for joining League of Nations. Communists attacked Locarno, so the area, because they saw it as a plot against the Soviet Union. So Locarno is a place in Switzerland. Communists attacked Locarno. They attacked that area, seeing it as a plot against Soviet Union. Now, the reason they saw it as a plot against the Soviet Union, is because Stresemann said, okay, we're happy with our western borders, but we're not going to say anything about our eastern borders. That's basically saying to the communists, hey, Germany might consider invading its east, trying to attack the Soviet Union. So communists saw that as a plot against the Soviet Union, not wanting to alter its eastern borders. It might try to invade the eastern borders later. So there was no mention against the eastern borders as a plot against the Soviet Union or the USSR. Now let's take a look at the economy. I'll change the color just to avoid monotony. Economy, positives in the economy. And we can look at negatives in the economy. So what are some positives for the economy? Well, reparation payments were spread over a longer period via the Dawes Plan. So I could just say reparations spread over a longer period. So there was less pressure on Germany, really, over a longer period. Old equipment was replaced with the latest technology. Old equipment, replaced with the latest technology. No more Imperial Germany, where everything's just kept the same. The old equipment was replaced by latest technology. We have wages for workers rising. Wages for workers rose. Obviously, national income was about a third of what it was in 1913. However, during the Stresemann era, wages for workers actually began to rise. And we have an increase in exports. Obviously, increases in exports are good, increases in imports are bad. We're going to have GDP growth. Increases in exports is a good thing. So some bad things is that about the economy is unemployment actually rose. Unemployment rose to 6%. US loans could be called in short notice. Could be called in short notice. And we also have overproduction in some goods, so a surplus of some goods. We can also look at politics. I can find some space. I guess I can't really go down anymore. Right, I've rewrote it so we had more space. So in politics, one great thing is that there were no more attempted revolutions. So he managed to settle everything down, and there was more peace. So no more attempted revolutions from those left-wing and right-wing areas. No more attempted revolutions. That was a good thing. Parties that supported the Weimar democracy did well and worked well together. So the Weimar democracy started to settle down. So parties that supported it, parties that supported the Weimar democracy, did well and worked well together during the Stresemann era. I also have some, and by this I mean there were less opposition, they were beginning to form coalitions, and they were beginning to have less frequent elections, so things were going more smoothly. Negative politics. What are some arguments there? Well, Nazis and communists were building up their party organizations, so Nazis and communists, while all of this is going on, they were building up their organizations. Building up their parties and their organizations. The right-wing threats were quiet rather than destroyed completely. So right-wing threats were not destroyed, or not completely eliminated or banned. For instance, the NSDAP, they ended up completely destroying the Weimar Republic. If only they were eliminated, this never would have happened. Hindenburg was elected president in 1925. Hindenburg elected president in 1925, and he was actually a critic of the Weimar Republic. Alright, so one more. Let's look at culture. Some positives for culture and some negatives for culture. So some positives for culture is that there was no more censorship. So people were more free, more equality, no more censorship. There was a Bill of Rights which guaranteed equality for all people, including Jews. So this is really the opposite to what the Nazis. It contrasted starkly with the Nazis' ideologies. So there was no more censorship. Artists like George Gross produced powerful paintings. We also have writers and poets who flourished in the golden age of drama. So artists, writers, poets flourished in the golden age of drama, in the golden age of cinema, I should say. Some negatives for culture is culture generally represented a moral decline, more lazier people, I guess, less organized and strict, like we saw in Imperial Germany. So there's general moral decline, more freedom. American immigrants, there were more freedom and equality given to American immigrants, Jewish artists, and musicians. So this is a negative in the eyes of the NSDAP, not necessarily us. It could be a good thing for us. But there were American immigrants. The NSDAP considered this to be a bad thing. American immigrants and Jewish artists and musicians who flourished. Jewish artists and musicians. I kind of put that over here. I'd say it's a good thing, but the NSDAP would consider that a bad thing. I want to do a quick diagram showing how the Weimar Constitution worked. The Weimar Constitution. So a constitution is clearly just a set of rules which describes how a state or country is meant to be run. So I want to look at the Weimar Constitution. So we have the president, and let me write that here. The president, originally this was Friedrich Ebert, and what he does is he appoints the chancellor. So I'll put the chancellor in a different color, maybe blue. And the chancellor actually appoints the government ministers. The government ministers. And the government sends laws to the Reichstag for approval. The president, if we go back to the president, he controls the armed forces. The president also appointed judges. Appoints judges in courts. He appoints the courts and judges. Now, if we go down, let's look at the German people. Now, I'll move it down a bit, actually. The German people play a significant role because they actually elect the president. They're the ones who vote for the president in the presidential elections. So the German people actually elect the president. The German people also elect the Reichstag, the parliament. Who's going to be in charge? Is it going to be the NSDAP, the KPD, the SPD? They elect the Reichstag. The Reichstag, or the parliament. They're the ones who elect the parties. Now we also have the German people who elect the 17 local governments for Bavaria, Prussia, and other regions. The Constitution limited their powers as much as possible, so the German people elected 17 local governments. For other regions in Germany, and their power was limited by the Constitution. So some significant things is Article 48, and that was actually used from 1930 to 19 33, and that gives presidential emergency powers. So gives presidential emergency powers. So the president doesn't have to consult Reichstag. Doesn't have to consult Reichstag. Also significant is the presidential elections. Presidential elections, people would vote for a new president, and that was held every 7 years. 7 years. And the Reichstag elections, so the parliament, who's going to be in charge of the parliament, Reichstag elections, were held every 4 years. They were held more often. They were held every 4 years. So they were arguably the Reichstag, the parliament, was a bit more significant because it was altered more often. To get some context, I think it'd be good to look at some presidents of the Weimar Republic. Here we have Friedrich Ebert, the first president, who took office in 1919 and died in office in the 28th of February 1925. We have Paul von Hindenburg, who took office in 12th of May 1925 and died in office on the 2nd of August 1934, which actually brings us to having Hitler become effectively Führer, which combines the positions of president and chancellor, from the 2nd of August 1934 to the 30th of April 1945, where he commits suicide. But he becomes chancellor on the 30th of January 1933, but it's not until Hindenburg dies that he actually becomes Führer, combines the role of chancellor and president. And if we look at chancellors, there were quite a few chancellors. How many is this? Don't know how many this is. What's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 different chancellors. This guy here, Philip Scheidman, took office 1933. He only lasted 100 days. Gustav Breuer, he lasted 279 days. Hermann Muller, 86 days. Konstantin Fehrenbach, 313 days. Joseph Wirth, a year, 188 days. This guy here, Wilhelm Kuno, 1 year, 202 days. These guys didn't last too long, really, to be honest. But then Gustav Stresemann, he was very good. He was responsible for the Stresemann era. He lasted 109 days, but then he became foreign minister, really. And then we have a whole bunch of other chancellors. And then you'll see these guys, Heinrich Brüning, Franz von Papen, and Kurt von Schleicher pop up. Later on, Kurt von Schleicher is murdered in the Night of the Long Knives. Franz von Papen is responsible for one of the plans to appoint Hitler as chancellor, and we'll see that later. But I think it's good to get some context over the different chancellor and president. And of course, we saw the different roles earlier. The idea of the chancellor is to appoint government ministers, and the idea, and of course, the government ministers send laws to the Reichstag for approval. And the president does a lot more. He controls the armed forces, the judges and courts, and he also appoints the chancellor. So the president does actually have a significant role, arguably more significant than the chancellor, who just appoints government ministers. So now I want to look at the SA, and they were the stormtroopers. They were also known as the stormtroopers, or the brown shirts, because they wore brown shirts, and they were Hitler's paramilitary units. They were Hitler's paramilitary units. Paramilitary basically means they're just organized similar to a military force, and their job was to disrupt left-wing meetings. So their job was to disrupt left-wing meetings.
And on the left wing, we have the KPD, who is far left wing, and the SPD, the German Communist Party, and the Social Democratic Party. They also needed to safeguard NSDAP meetings, make sure those weren't interrupted or spied upon. Safeguard NSDAP meetings. And they also had a major role. They had a role in the Munich Putsch, which was obviously in 1923. And the essay was made up largely of ex-members of the Free Corps, who were ex-nationalist soldiers. So it made up largely of ex-members of Free Corps. And the essay was actually led by Ernst Röhm, who was later assassinated in the Night of the Long Knives. Supposedly because he was planning a coup, but this just ended up to be false. It was a false justification for Hitler to kill him. The power of essay is limited by the night. The power of the essay was limited by the Night of the Long Knives. So limited by Night of Long Knives. Hitler thought the essay was becoming too independent. He didn't like where Ernst Röhm was going with some of his ideas, so he killed him. You go more into that later. Why did the Nazis have little success before 1930? Why'd they have little success before 1930 in the Great Depression? If we look at this graph over here, we can see that before 1930, there was relatively low support for the Nazi NSDAP party. Then after 1929, the Great Depression, we see a fairly significant increase in the percentage of votes. So why was there this increase? And we'll look at that later. But why was there such low support before 1930? And the first reason is because of the disastrous putsch in 1923, the failed Munich Putsch. The failed Munich Putsch in 1923. That was one of the reasons they had little success. We have the successes of the Weimar Republic, successes of Weimar government under Stresemann during the Stresemann era between 1923 and 1929. Successes of Weimar Republic. If life's getting better in Weimar Republic, what's the point of voting for extreme parties such as the Nazis if life is getting better with the Stresemann era? We have the economy getting better, foreign policy, politics, Germans joining the League of Nations with Treaty of Locarno, all these good things are happening. So, economy, foreign policy, during the Stresemann era, there were immense successes of the Weimar Republic. The hyperinflation crisis was solved. So why should we vote for the Nazis? And you can see that from the results. During the Stresemann era, between 1923 and 1929, virtually no support for the Nazis. We also have most industrial workers who support left-wing parties. Most industrial workers supported left-wing parties. So we're talking about industrial workers, not the big businesses. We're talking about workers. The workers are generally on the left, so because more equal distribution of wealth, get the big businesses to give the workers the money. This is why industrial workers generally support left-wing parties. We also have the Nazis' aims were irrelevant to Germans. Nazis' aims
irrelevant to Germans. And to just expound upon these ideas, if we're looking at the successes of the Weimar government, in particular, I want to focus on the no more attempted revolutions, the fact that there were no more attempted revolutions, the parties of the Weimar government parties that supported the Weimar democracy did well and worked well together. So they formed coalitions, less frequent elections, generally just more successful. Wages for workers rose. Wages for workers rose. I don't know if you can see that over there, as you can see there. And Germany joins the League of Nations and Treaty of Locarno. We could go on forever. Germany joins Alaven. That means League of Nations. Okay, so we can also look at the image or the reputation of the Nazis. So the Nazis had a poor image. We can see this from the beer hall putsch. So beer hall putsch or the Munich putsch. That's clearly just reiterating the point, but I'm talking about the disastrous image of the Nazis. It's another reason they had little success. Disastrous image and reputation of the Nazis. It had a poor reputation, and this was because of the failed beer hall putsch. Hitler had been sent to jail. And we also have the Nazi Party, who was banned. And also, the SA, who were connected with the Nazis, were seen as extremely hostile and aggressive towards the people. So why would the people vote for an organization that was linked with the SA, who was hostile and aggressive towards the people? Most industrial workers, again, supported left-wing parties, so the election results showed little support. And the lack of appeal to Nazis' 25-point program, or most aims were relevant to Germans, so lack of appeal. Lack of appeal to 25-point program. So, anti-Semitism wasn't really... Germans weren't really concerned with anti-Semitism. They just wanted money. They just wanted a job. They just wanted everyone to get along. They weren't concerned with anti-Semitism or living space, Lebensraum. They just wanted to get a stable government and a stable job, a steady income. They wanted a currency that would actually allow them to buy the goods that they needed to feed their families. So they weren't concerned with anti-Semitism or living space, which were found in Nazis' 25-point program. So that is why the Nazis had little success before 1930. So let's take a look at Germany between 1928 and 1933. This is the period of Hitler's rise of power, the NSDAP's rise of power. So as we can see here, after 1928, we can see a general steady decline in popularity for the NSDAP. We have a sharp rise, and then a kind of a small fall here, and then a sharp rise again. So if we look at the 1928 election, we have 12 seats, 2.6%, so it's not much. And then in October 29, we have the Wall Street crash, the famous Black Tuesday, the Great Depression. And this is after this.
is basically when Hitler begins to start gaining support. In 1930, Hindenburg appoints von Breuning chancellor, and Article 48 is enforced. So Germany is run under Article 48. The president does not have to consult the Reichstag. In the September election in 1930, the NSDAP gets 18.3% or 107 seats. In 1932, Hitler gains 37% of the presidential election. So this isn't the party election. This isn't the Reichstag or the parliament election. This is a presidential election, and he gets 37% of the vote, but he is defeated by Hindenburg. In May 1932, Hindenburg appoints von Papen chancellor, and in July, the NSDAP gets 230 seats. So that's quite a significant amount. So 37.3%, and over here it says 37.4, but nonetheless, we have November where it gets 196 seats, so 33.1%. So there is a small drop there in actual support. So there is an argument that, hey, maybe if it wasn't for Hitler's appointment as chancellor, Germany would have continued, the support of the NSDAP would have continued going down, but it was because of Hitler's appointment as chancellor in 1933 that we see it begin to go up. But nonetheless, we have that 33.1% in November 1932, and in December, Hindenburg appoints von Schleicher chancellor, and in 1933, on the 30th of January, Hindenburg appoints Hitler chancellor, and he doesn't become Führer until Hindenburg's death in the 2nd of August 1934, where Hitler actually combines the position of chancellor and Führer, chancellor and president into Führer. So he's basically the dictator of Germany. One more thing here. Proportional representation was in each party, so the number of votes really defined the number of seats. So under proportional representation, I'll write it real quickly. Under proportional representation, representation, I cannot spell today, votes define your seats. So you can't just have a government in power all the time. Your votes are really what are going to define your seats. So it kind of makes it more difficult to obtain a stable government. So it's less efficient, more difficult to obtain stable government, and it's less efficient. It's less efficient than just letting a government take control under a dictatorship. However, it is more fair. So that is the system of proportional representation right there. So this one's fairly significant. How did the 1929 Great Depression affect Germany overall? What effects did it have on Germany? So effect in A right there. So first, it had economic effects. So obviously the Great Depression was terrible. It ruined many countries. It had severe economic effects on Germany. 6 million people were unemployed. Were actually unemployed by 1932. This is before Hitler became chancellor. 50% unemployment for youth between 16 to 33. So an entire half of youth were unemployed. And the youth means people aged between 16 and 33. Alright, so there was a rise in support for extreme parties. I'll do this in red. The Great Depression led to a rise in support for extreme parties. A rise in support for extreme parties, and we've seen that. We've seen that from the NSDAP's rapid increase in votes. We've seen that right here. We see that after the Great Depression, clearly in 1929, and then after the Great Depression, we just see a sharp increase in the NSDAP's votes due to the Great Depression, because people were desperate. They They didn't think that Weimar government was doing anything to help the problem, so they just began to vote for extreme parties who promised to solve the problem. And Hitler was a great orator. He managed to convince the people that the NSDAP would be able to solve these problems, which they eventually did manage to do so by building there and expanding the German army. But anyway, it led to a rise in support for extreme parties such as the NSDAP. You can just look at these percentages rise rapidly here. It also led, KPD is also, so with the NSDAP right there, KPD was also a party which led to a rise in support, but not as much as the NSDAP, because the NSDAP was even more extreme than the KPD. We also have Germany run by the president using Article 48. Germany run, I'll just say, under Article 48. This basically means the president, well, Article 48 is synonymous to emergency powers. The president can run the country how he wants without consulting the Reichstag. Emergency powers. So the president is allowed to take emergency actions without, or use or exercise his emergency powers without prior consultation of the Reichstag. There was a large number of elections and chancellors, so it was inefficient. It was going, the Reichstag was going crazy. Large number of elections as well as chancellors. There were new chancellors all the time. As we've seen, there were 14 of them. And the country's in desperation. It blames the existing government, hence the votes for extreme parties. So the country is in desperation, blaming existing government for the crisis, even though it wasn't really the existing government's fault. But the people blame the government, and so they voted for new parties in the hope that the new parties would be able to solve the problems of the effects of the Great Depression. So what were some of the government solutions? Let's take a look at some of the government solutions. So you could one option was to print money. However, this was not an option. Not an option. Why was it not an option? Well, it's because of the hyperinflation crisis in 1923. They didn't want to repeat that. So because of the hyperinflation crisis in 1923, they could not print more money. They did not want to repeat that mistake. So what were some of the other options? Well, they could balance the budget. They could balance the budget. And what do I mean by that? I'm saying raise taxes. Cut government expenditure. This is also known as austerity. So they wanted to cut social welfare. Cut social welfare. This was obviously unpopular. This was unpopular to the German people. Of course, there were 6 million unemployed. That was not those 6 million. They lost the support of those 6 million people by balancing the budget. And this was considered a global solution. So anyway, this balancing the budget in particular, this cutting social welfare and balancing the budget, this led to support for extreme parties, led to hatred of Weimar Republic, and support for extreme parties. So the Great Depression meant the government had to do something. They balanced the budget, and that led to people hating them, which led to them supporting extreme parties such as the NSDAP. So why did the NSDAP succeed in the elections between 1930 to 1933? Why did NSDAP succeed in the elections? So one reason was Nazi campaigning, and we'll go into further detail. Second was negative cohesion. The things the Nazis hated, the people also hated. So they hated the Treaty of Versailles. Nazis hated the Treaty of Versailles. The people also hated the Treaty of Versailles for making Germany poor and all that. Disillusionment with democracy. So Nazis criticized the Weimar Republic. The people also criticized the Weimar Republic, saying that it didn't do what it said it was going to do. We also had the communist threat, which the Nazis promised to solve. Communist threat and decadence, which is basically just morality, traditional morality. So if we look at Nazi campaigning, I'd also say the Great Depression is one of the major reasons they succeeded. It led to hatred of the Weimar Republic, which also led to a rise in popularity of extreme parties because people were dissatisfied with their conditions. It led to major economic effects. So I'd say the Great Depression is one of the major reasons that the Nazis succeeded. I'll highlight that. The Great Depression is one of the major reasons for success, but we're looking at some other reasons. So Nazi campaigning. Hitler used films, radio, and records to bring his message to millions of people. He was able to appear to be a man of the people and understand their worries. So, used film, radio to disseminate the Nazi messages. Hitler was a man of the people. He understood their worries and exploited them. We've seen that earlier, understood their worries. Negative cohesion. Also, with Nazi campaigning, we can say Nazi posters, pamphlets, and propaganda. And the large rallies impress people with their energy. Large rallies impress people with their energy. Frequent street battles. People needed order. Nazis provided hostels for the unemployed. This is significant. Nazis provided hostels for unemployed. This is some evidence you can use that Nazi campaigning was successful and why they gained the support between 1930 and 1933. The Nazis provide hostels for unemployed. That's evidence that Nazi campaigning was successful. So negative cohesion. We can look at people shared Nazi fears, not Nazi views. So people shared Nazi fears. People shared Nazi fears. So people were disappointed with democracy. That's this one here. The Weimar government couldn't solve problems of depression and cut government expenditure. This led to unemployed people supporting Nazis. So Weimar government government couldn't solve problems, so it couldn't solve problems of depression, and it also cut government expenditure, so it cut expenditure by cutting social welfare that was unpopular, and this led to unemployed people supporting the Nazis. The communist threat, another shared negative, farmers and businesses didn't want their land under state control. So farmers and businesses supported the Nazis because they didn't want their land under communist threat. So farmers and businesses, because communism, that's where the state owns everything. Farmers and businesses didn't want their land under state control. If you were a farmer, you wouldn't want the communists taking power and then taking all of your land and all of your wealth. You'd vote for the Nazis because they promised to help you. The Nazis promised to have a right-wing ideology where your land does not go under state control. So Nazis promised to help them. So they gained support of them. Nazis promised to help farmers and businesses. And we also have decadence. So Nazis talked about restoring old-fashioned traditional values. So restoration of old-fashioned traditional values. So of course we saw a moral decline in the Stresemann era. So there was a moral decline. People were less orderly, I guess you could say. So these are some of the reasons why the Nazis succeeded in the elections between 1930 and 1933. Finally, let's look at Hitler's appointment as Chancellor. Let's look at Hitler's appointment as Chancellor, which is really fortunate for the NSDAP, because there is an argument that if Hitler was not appointed as Chancellor, that the NSDAP would have inevitably fell. But anyway, Hitler's appointment as Chancellor between 1932 and 1933. So the NSDAP actually became the largest party in the Reichstag in July 1933, where they achieved, in July 1932, where they achieved 37% of the vote. So around July, well, July is around in the middle of the year, so around July 1932, they achieved 37% of the vote. I guess it looks about right. So largest party in Reichstag. So in July 1932, NSDAP, largest party. So they get more votes than any other party. So in general, if you become the largest party in the Reichstag during the Weimar Republic, it normally meant that the party's leader would become chancellor. So normally Hitler should really be becoming chancellor because his party has the largest majority. It is the largest party in the Reichstag. However, Hindenburg refused to make Hitler chancellor. Hindenburg initially refused to appoint Hitler chancellor. He's allowed to do that. He's allowed to refuse a certain person. So Hindenburg refused to appoint Hitler chancellor. Why? Because he saw him as too extreme. Hitler was Austrian. He didn't like that. He wasn't actually German. He had an Austrian background. His Munich Putsch gave the Nazis a bad image. He had a low military rank. He was affiliated with the SA, which was seen as hostile and belligerent towards the people, and he'd also been to jail. And his party was also banned. So there's a lot of things, there's a lot of reasons why Hindenburg initially refused to appoint him as chancellor in July 1932. Instead, von Papen was appointed chancellor, but he was unable to form a government as the NSDAP would not cooperate in a coalition, so therefore there was a new election, and in November 1932, the NSDAP support fell by 2 million votes. So in November 1932, we can see that here, the NSDAP support actually fell by 2 million votes. So NSDAP, I should write that here, NSDAP support in the November 1932 election fell by 2 million votes. Not looking good. However, Schleicher, the new chancellor, is still unable to form a government without NSDAP support. So von Papen, who was the previous chancellor, he was rival to Schleicher. He actually persuades Hindenburg to make Hitler chancellor, with himself as vice chancellor. So von Papen wants Hitler to be chancellor, and he wants to become vice chancellor. So, von Papen and Hindenburg kind of got together with their covert scheming. They kind of tried to use Hitler. They underestimated Hitler. They really tried to use him as a way to just form a stable government and enforce their own ideologies. They underestimated the power of Hitler. They didn't really think Hitler would be able to do anything. But Hindenburg accepted, and Hitler was offered 3 out of 12 cabinet posts, and without a majority in the Reichstag, the logic was that Hitler could be contained. So Hitler was appointed chancellor in January 30th, 1933. So after covert scheming, between Hindenburg and Schleicher, no, not Schleicher, and von Papen, Hitler is appointed chancellor, with von Papen as vice chancellor. And this is on, Hindenburg appoints him chancellor on January the 30th, 1933. That's when Hitler's appointed chancellor. So they thought they could control him and just use him as a way to form a stable government. Use him to form a stable government and enforce their own ideas. To form a stable government and get a majority vote. So Hitler was offered 3 out of 12 cabinet posts. So let's look at some of Hitler's weaknesses. So weaknesses of Hitler's position. His support is on the decline. He's got a lack of majority. He lacks the majority. Lack of a majority. And his support's on the decline. We saw that when he lost 2 million votes between January 1932 and November 1932. Support on decline. Maybe if he wasn't appointed chancellor, the support would have continued being on the decline. Who knows? He only has 3 out of 12 in the cabinet. He only has 3 out of 12 cabinet posts. There's potential opponents. There's potential opponents to Hitler and his ideologies. That includes the KPD, the German Communist Party, the SPD, the Social Democrats Party, and so the potential opponents were the German Communist Party, the Social Democratic Party, and also the army could oppose him. And Hindenburg could remove Hitler at any point, because Hitler's only chancellor. Hindenburg, on the other hand, is president, so Hindenburg can remove Hitler